let me now begin my introduction um, for our speaker, Rachel Berenbaum. And I want to tell all of you that um, we wanted to have Rachel Berenbaum, as some of you know, last spring. And when the university was forced, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, to close the campus, I had to write Rachel Berenbaum and say that we were not going to be able to have her on the campus. And she told me in the communication that she would love to do something called Zoom. I hadn't really at that point had little understanding of what the power of Zoom was. And so when we began to plan our program for this year, we wanted to have Rachel Berenbaum back as the bridge between the program that was unfortunately cut short by the virus, as a kind of bridge to our new program, and really to the future. So I'm delighted that Rachel was willing to start our 24th year. I believe this is the 24th year of the Taubman Symposia, and I'm delighted that she has agreed to join us. Now, let me tell you just very briefly about this wonderful book, A Bend in the Stars. I originally bought it on in its hardback version, and I want to read to you one of the comments about this book, about this novel, that appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books. And the review read about A Bend in the Stars: an epic adventure that spins through rich terrain, several engrossing love stories, including one between remarkable siblings, and a scientific intrigue that pits dark ambition against a passionate love of science. The characters Berenbaum brings to life demonstrate resilience in the face of prejudice, steadfastness in the face of defeat, and the ability to love even when the world has cracked with hate. I think this is an extraordinary description of this novel, and why I think it has reached many people, because it does have a kind of salvific dimension to it. I should tell you that when Rachel and I spoke during the week, she said she likes writing about science, and I said, "Well, this is a scientific thriller." And she then told me about her second novel, which will appear in February 2022. So it's a little bit more than a year away. But you might want to just note it. It is the title of the second novel is Atomic Anna. I love that title. Now, Rachel has, of course, degrees in literature and philosophy and business, and has has had a career in business. But she told me that she always wanted to be a writer. And so I think in Rachel Berenbaum, we have one of these young Jewish writers who is going to put a mark on American Jewish fiction in very substantial ways. So Rachel, thank you for joining us and kicking off this 24th year of the Taubman Jewish Studies Symposia. Please.
Wow, Richard, thank you so much. What an introduction. And Maeve, congratulations on the website. It looks fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. I was really disappointed when I couldn't come last spring. I was so looking forward to being there in person. And I'm thrilled to be here today as well. I wish it could be in person, as we said last week when we were speaking, maybe for the next book. But for now, I'm so excited to be here. So thank you for that introduction and for having me. So I'm gonna share my screen and take you through a little bit about A Bend in the Stars. And you're going to notice that I have two different covers here. Behind me right now, you see my paperback cover, which is the red cover. And this blue cover here is the hardback. So same book. You might have read it in either form. I'm not sure. Just waiting for this to go into presentation mode. So here we go. So A Bend in the Stars is the book. So as was noted, I did start out in business. So I graduated from Harvard. I spent some time at the Shalem Center in Israel. I thought I would be a writer or a philosopher. And I studied creative writing with Jamaica Kincaid. And then I realized I was not going to be able to pay off my loans as a writer or as a philosopher. And I ended up in business and then at the Harvard Business School. And one of the stories that I love to tell is before you start school, you have to take a bunch of tests before you enroll in the MBA, and it's supposed to be a way for them to help you figure out what you should be. And so they ask questions, for example, do you see yourself in a boardroom? Do you see yourself trading stocks on this, on the exchange floor? Do you see yourself as a consultant or in marketing? Or do you see yourself as a novelist? And that was sort of the outlier, right? So of course I checked novelist, and they call me in for my first meeting where they're supposed to sit you down and say, well, according to this, you should really, look into whatever the career path is. And they said, we never have anybody check novelist. What are you doing here? I said, well, I don't know, but I'm here, so what should I do? And I have to say that the answer was not that helpful, although I did go into, from there, trading stocks and hedge funds. And I was running a fund, but writing all the time, writing at night, writing on the weekends. And about 200 to 300 rejections in, I sat down, it was 2014, and I said, what are you doing trading stocks still in this hedge fund? What do you want to do with your life? And I realized that I really wanted to be writing, and it was time. And so I applied to the Grub Street Novel Incubator, which is a one-year program with the novel that would become A Bend in the Stars. And when they accepted me, I actually closed down my fund, closed down all my businesses, just went full in. I said, I'm going to do this. It is time. And I felt like just this huge relief and deep breath when I walked in the door there of Grub Street. Like, these were people that understood, and we can talk about books and they wouldn't be the outlier while everyone is talking about stocks and valuations. So A Bend in the Stars, for those of you that haven't read the book yet, it's set in 1914 Russia, and it's the story of a Jewish scientist who's racing Einstein to prove relativity. He's so caught up in this race that he goes after a total solar eclipse that's going to fall over Russia, and he goes missing. And his sister Miri, who is one of the first female surgeons in Russia, goes after him. She's really the hero, she's the protagonist. And it's the story, the brother-sister story and the adventures that happen along the way. There's love, of course. There's science, of course. There's a lot of adventure. And when it comes down to it, though, A Bend in the Stars is also really about the question of, when do we run? When is it no longer safe to stay in our home and in our homeland? And where do we go? What are we willing to give up for our family, for our future? So this book was 4 years in the works. I told you that I started writing it in 2014. I went to the Grub Street Novel Incubator Program 2015 to 2016. And at the end of that, I found my amazing agent at William Morris, WME. She took me under her wing and worked on the book with me for an entire year. She brought in a couple of other agents and we went through it. And then she said, all right, it's time. I'm going to take it out and sell this book. And I sat down at that point and I was like, her name is Eve Aderman. And I said, Eve, I need you to sell this quickly because I have really jumped in here, given up everything. I need to know if this is going to happen. She did an amazing job. She sold the book in 2 weeks to Grand Central Publishing, who then bought the second book as well. And they bought it in 2017. And then again, it was 2 years until it was published in 2019. So the first year is spent editing the book, and then a year sort of publicizing and sending out early copies before it actually comes out. And I like to just talk about this process because writing takes a very long time. And, there are a lot of pieces in it that I didn't know about. And also, when people talk about, oh, it took me 10 years, well, this is why, because you spend all this time, right, doing your research and writing, but then the publishing process itself can be quite slow. So where did I get the idea for this book? A scientist racing Einstein to prove relativity. In 2014, I was reading this issue of Scientific American, and it has these little sections that say 100 years ago today, 50 years ago today, 25 years ago today. And it said 100 years ago, or this month, not today, 100 years ago this month, Einstein was on the verge of proving relativity. He had the theory, he had equations, which turned out to be wrong, but okay, he had equations. And what he didn't have was physical evidence, and that would be a photograph from a total solar eclipse that he could then use to measure and show that light bends. And he was going after it because in 1914, a total solar eclipse was due over Russia. In fact, he inspired many expeditions to go to Russia to also photograph this total solar eclipse, but he never made it. He raised the money, he got all these people together, and Einstein's team was stopped at the border. So Einstein didn't get his proof in 1914. It wasn't until 1919 with Arthur Eddington that he actually was able to prove relativity, and by then he had changed his math, he had corrected it. And I just thought before I even put that down, that magazine down, that issue down, that is a book. That is an amazing story, that there were all kinds of people, other expeditions racing to prove relativity. And I thought, what if I could create a character that beats Einstein or races Einstein? Of course, that would mean that I had to set the book in Russia. And my family actually came to America from Russia. And this is a picture of them that they showed. My great aunts in particular loved showing this picture, although they never really told me who was in it. No one was really sure of the history of it. But they came to our house every Friday night, most Friday nights for Shabbat, my great aunts. And they would call me over and they would bend down very close and they would say, Rachel, come here. And I would go over and I knew it was coming. And I was always a little scared because they smelled like herring and they were drinking Manischewitz. And, they would say, Rachel, do you know where the passports are and the emergency money? And I would always nod because of course I did. I knew that was my job. And they said, remember, we had to run from Russia, right? We thought we were comfortable, but we weren't. And you might have to run from America. Don't forget. And that's a terrifying thing. And I would say, tell me more. What was so bad about Russia? This doesn't look so bad. And they refused to talk about it. They said, we're American now. We don't speak Russian. We don't speak Yiddish. We speak English only. Move on. Make the better life that we came here to build. And so, of course, all I've ever wanted to know about is Russia, right? Is 1900, 1950 in Russia. So I really started digging into pictures as I'm thinking about this Einstein story. And I'm asking, was life really that terrible? And then I came across this picture. And yes, in fact, it really was that terrible. This is what life as a Jew living in Russia was actually like. And I just looked at this picture and the desperation and the clothing and the dirt. And I feel like these people are hungry. And I just think this is what the life was that my family left behind when they came to America. Maybe I understand why they don't want to talk about it. Although I really wish they would, and I regret it that they didn't because now they've passed, but this is what it was like. And I just keep this picture in mind when I, talk about this book and when I'm writing this book, when I was writing Bend in the Stars, because I just keep, just remember this is what it was. It's easy to romanticize Russia and the Tsar and the Romanovs, and you see these beautiful Hollywood movies, but this is the reality of the life that my characters and probably my family was more likely living in. Now, 1914 itself is also a time period that I've loved and been obsessed with for a long time, for other reasons too. It was really a moment where there was an explosion of ideas. There was a faith in human ability. There was this belief in truth. Right here we have Einstein as an example, who is challenging Newton and Newtonian physics. And here he is, but he's riding this wave of all of these massive ideas. And so just to give you an idea, remind you of what's happening around then, we have amazing artists who are also challenging the status quo in traditional art, like Modigliani. We have the fight for women's suffrage in America. We have Chaim Weizmann, of course, pushing for the Balfour Declaration. We have Freud. These are big ideas people are thinking about and pushing, really big ideas to change the world. And of course, along with it, we then end up on the verge of a horrid destruction of World War I. But that moment before war broke out, that time period is incredible. If you think about all of the ways in which the world was changing and the ideas that were coming out at that time, absolutely amazing. And I love to read about them. And I wanted to capture that energy in this book. One of my favorite philosophers, of course, then wrote, August 1914 touched off a chain reaction in which we have been caught ever since and which nobody seems to be able to stop. So then we go from this super high to an incredible low with World War I, and you see humanity and the horrid things that those big ideas could then lead to, right? Chemical weapons, tanks, which even I talk about in the book, warfare, right? Horrid things that the world begins to unleash. But that moment right before, again, that's what I wanted to focus on. That's what I wanted to capture. So this brings me to one of the main questions in the book, which is, what is time? This is a question I've been thinking about for a while. Since I took my first philosophy class at Harvard, the professor walked in and asked this question one day, what is time? And I thought, oh, this is ridiculous. It's seconds, minutes, hours, right? This is my instant reaction. And then she says, no, time is invented. Does it matter what time it is on the moon? Does Saturn care if it's, January 5th or October 18th, at 6 o'clock or 3 o'clock? No, time does not exist. It is something that we have all agreed upon. And then there's some really big questions in there from a philosophical perspective or point of view. What is time? Why do we track time? Why does time matter? There's some practical answers for that. But as a bigger picture, why does it matter if you're 50 years old or 10 years old? How does that all make a difference in how you see things or understand the world around you? Well, Einstein was thinking about this a lot. When he graduated and finished his graduate studies, of course, he famously couldn't get a job and ended up in the patent examiner's office in Bern. And he was really working on the question of simultaneity, how to synchronize clocks. I love to show this picture because this is Einstein in the patent examiner's office, and he is in the back. And it's hard to see him. And usually when we think about Einstein, he's in the front, he's in the center, he's a big, larger than life personality, big hair, right? But here he is, he's a nobody. He's a nothing. He couldn't even get a job. And so he's got this little corner office because his friend helped him get a job, little desk in this office. And he's given the task of examining machines that could be used to synchronize clocks. So for the first time, we have people all over the world that need to agree what time it is, so you can set schedules for trains or boats or cars or whatever it might be, right? So that we all around the world could come together on Zoom today at this hour, at this time, and click in. How did we do that? We have to all agree on a time, on a clock. And so Einstein is working on this question. How do we synchronize clocks? And he sees some crazy ideas like pneumatic tubes, flares, I don't know, he sees it all, right? And he's sitting there thinking, how do we synchronize clocks? What makes the most sense? And he comes to light. And he's been obsessed with light, the nature of light, what is light, for a long time. And his answer is we have to use light to synchronize clocks. And we use it because it's a constant. We know the speed. So if you have started your clock at one time, and I see the light, it hits me, and I know to start my clock then, you can calculate, knowing how long it's gone, how long it's traveled, you can calculate the exact time, and you can use that to synchronize clocks. So he's coming to light, and he's thinking, yes, that's true, except that's only true if light travels in a straight line. Is light always traveling in a straight line? And then you look up at the eclipse, and he's looking at light and thinking about it. And then he realizes, no, light is not always traveling in a straight line. And this brings him to the really big idea of relativity and gravity. And this is where he challenges the notion that gravity is just the force that pulls the apple down from the tree. He's saying, actually, gravity warps space itself and the universe. So I actually found this video online. I'm not going to show you the video. These are just little pictures of it from this teacher whom I don't know. I've never met him. I just watched his video because I thought he did such a great and clear and concise and engaging video of explaining relativity to his students. So he has this huge piece of Lycra here. He says it's his bike shorts as a joke, but no, just a piece of Lycra. So Newton, right, traditional physics thinks about the universe is flat as this piece that you see right here. And what Einstein does is he says, in fact, that's wrong. Look at this, if we put this in the middle, imagine this is the sun in our solar system, and you put this big heavy weight in, you're actually warping the shape of the universe. And you've probably been to a science museum or you've seen somewhere this experiment. Now, if you try to roll a marble across, right, this surface, the marble or the tennis ball, whatever you might use, an orange, would go straight across. But in this example, with the weight in the middle, the light would, or the marble or the orange, whatever it is, would bend around it. It wouldn't be a straight line across that light graph. And Einstein says, that's it. Light is not traveling in a straight line because gravity is warping space. Now here on Earth, for small distances, when you're synchronizing clocks between London and Rome or wherever, it doesn't really matter in the same extent as in the rest of the universe. But this was his big idea that came to him. And so he said, how am I going to prove that? And this brings him to the total solar eclipse, because this is the moment where you can see stars that you can't otherwise see. And then you can calculate, right, how much light has shifted and actually figure out if it has bent, right, if there is a bend in the stars, as it were. So I started digging more and more into this expedition and this, right, this research, this push to learn about relativity. And I thought, well, there were other expeditions, actually, even an American expedition that made it to Russia. What did it look like? And this picture is something that I unearthed from one of the actual expeditions that was set up in Russia in 1914 to observe the eclipse. Now, by all reports, it was rainy, overcast, dark day, and so nobody actually took a picture at the eclipse that happened in 1914. But I still think somebody might have gotten a shot, right? Maybe it's the romantic, the dreamer in me. But look at, this is the equipment that they would have used. This was the most high-tech, most, expensive, amazing equipment that they could have come up with. It was taken all the way from America, shipped over, and then they had to build these massive, I don't know what you want to call them, holders, stands, whatever, for all this different equipment. But this is what it would have looked like if you were at the dacha and you were going to watch the eclipse and it wasn't rainy. And so this really helped me imagine, right, to set the stage for the way my characters were going to be viewing the eclipse if they made it there. I really tried very hard to keep everything in the book absolutely real, truly, historically accurate, true to life. The characters are all made up, but the actual scenes in terms of what you see, what the Jews were able to do, or the non-Jews, what Russia was like, all true to life. And so when I explain and depict the scene of, where they're going to see the eclipse, this is what I base it on. Again, this true to life setup that was arranged to view the eclipse. So how did I do my research? What did I come across? I used YIVO, which is the online Jewish encyclopedia, very extensively, and I'll show you a number of pictures from there. But also National Geographic put out this incredible issue right before World War I. They had sent their team of photographers and reporters, they spent an enormous amount of time to get to know Russia, because even then there was a little bit of a romantic element, this huge swath of the earth controlled by the one family, right, the Tsar, and what was it like? And I actually bought this copy, the National Geographic magazine, on eBay when I started my research. And it was a great place to start to get a sense of how do I build the world that my characters are going to live in. So my characters walk down the street, what do they smell? What do they feel? If they jump on a train, There are a number of train scenes, you know that from the cover probably, because there's the train on both of them. But if they're on a train and there's a fight, what are they going to bump into? What's going to be in the train with them? So I really had to dig into these picture archives because I knew the history and I knew the ideas that were happening in Russia, right? I mentioned that I was obsessed with that and I read all about that. But you know, being able to talk about the dates or the people is different from being able to see it and then actually being able to write a book about it. So here are some pictures of the same exact street. The one on the top is approximately, it's somewhere between 1905 and 1914, and then 100 years later, we see the same exact street. And I believe this is in Moscow. And I love looking at this juxtaposition because people ask me all the time, you know, you must have spent a lot of time in Russia. Did you, like, how much time did you spend in Russia to research this book? And I say, well, actually, you know, my family forbid me from going to Russia as a child, the Soviet Union then. You know, I wasn't allowed to go then. I can't imagine going. That generation has passed, but they so clearly detested that country. They left it and they never wanted us to set foot on there again. And that's still in my head. So no, I didn't actually make it there to research, but even if I had, I think it would not have helped the book because this picture on the top is what my book is set in, and the picture on the bottom would have given me a different idea of what my character's life was like. So I really stuck to these pictures more like the ones on the top here. And just look at how the men are sitting down. I don't know if they're sorting rocks, right? They're repairing the street. And you see the tram, the trolley, and you see the, you know, the horses, the horse-drawn carriage. I just love this picture. And here's one other. You can actually see if you look closely. I hope the resolution is good enough. In the background, the exact same church in both, and it's on the river, on the side of the river there. And you can see what a difference, right? 100 years has made to that riverbank. And the picture on the top, actually, I'm going to read to you the section that it inspired and how I wrote it. So let's see. I said, well, let me get down to it. Okay. So Miri hurried. This is how I wrote about Miri's first time when she gets to this riverbank. And she's just had a horrible experience in surgery, her first solo surgery. And she's about to meet the soldier who's going to be thrown out of the train. So Miri hurried. Without the sun, the air was tinged with the smell of damp, and the limestone buildings that framed the road looked darker than they should. As she descended into the slums, streetlights cast shadows that magnified the laddered appearance of the tiled rooftops. She tucked Tamara's hat into her bag and tried to think about how she'd break the news to Anatoly's mother. She thought she was following Tamara's careful directions, but she didn't know this section of the city. In 4 turns, she was lost. She tried to retrace her steps, but when she came out at the river, she knew she was even farther from where she wanted to be, deep in the city's underbelly of mills and factories. She looked around, tried to plan her route home. The triangular roof on the tower of Kovno Castle loomed in the distance. The bulk of the train station rose nearby, and the great bridge hung overhead. She'd always seen it from above, where the stanchions were polished and the road sparkled with lamps. But from this new perspective, she saw it was decrepit, and the riverbank that appeared pristine was in fact a wasteland of gravel littered with rags and fish heads coated in pollen. So that came from this picture and this picture. So this is the above the bridge picture, and then this is more looking a little further down the road, but the below the bridge picture there. So this is how I use this kind of research to write the book and to really feel the scenes that I tried to put onto the pages. So I'm going to go through a couple quickly just to give you the sense of this is what it would feel like to walk through parts of Russia in 1914. I'm always struck by the amount of dirt on people's boots and the hems of their clothing. Here you see the child who's carrying the heavy lifting, doing the bigger work there, while the others are walking along. Just scenes from everyday life. This is one of my favorites because this is an actual matchmaker. My book opens with Mary's babushka is a matchmaker that she lives with, and this man with the black hat is a matchmaker, and he's there, I guess, finding the beshert for the man with the white hat, his soulmate. And look, you can briefly see there are different languages up there. As a reminder, Yiddish is written with the Hebrew alphabet, so this is not actually Hebrew, but Yiddish that you're seeing. But look at the dirt on his shoes, on their shoes, and the hems of their pants. And then you've got the guy sort of lingering, lurking in the background as they're working on the match. And I thought, what a scene if I could put that in the book. Here again is another picture. This is Kaunas, which is Kovno. In the book, Kovno, Russia, now Kaunas, Lithuania. And look at all the different languages. And the trees look so desolate. It's dark, it's winter, dirt again. I just try to imagine my characters walking down these streets. So one of the big things, parts of the book, is the fact that Mary is one of Russia's first female surgeons, and she works always on the, the paupers ward. So the Jewish hospitals were the best wards, but the best hospitals, but of course you had the paying wards and the paupers wards. And so this is a picture from the paying rich ward where you would see everyone is happy and round cheeks and smiling and clean. And this juxtaposes with what you would see below in the paupers ward. And these two pictures just struck me, sort of painfully to think that this would happen, that you would see such a difference. Not that it's so different perhaps from today and the differences we see in healthcare either. And these pictures really draw that out. And so I just want to read a brief passage and how I explain this difference also. For those of you who have the blue hardback, it's on the bottom of 309. And it says, Miri met Anya in the lobby and followed her on a tour of the hospital. It was divided into distinct sections. The third floor was a converted attic where sleeping quarters were carved into the rafters. The second floor was for patrons and paying patients, separated by a marble lobby. The men's and women's wards were gilded and frescoed, lit by chandeliers. The women read books and sewed. The men smoked cigarettes. Without the men wearing uniforms, Mary couldn't tell who was an officer. But Anya confided there were several. The first floor was for those who couldn't afford to pay. The men's and women's wings were gray and loud. Cots were shoehorned into every corner. Patients played cards and groaned and gambled. Children slept under their mothers' beds. It felt like Kovno's free clinic. So there again, you have the difference, right? The chandeliers, the quiet, the separation, versus the children sleeping underneath their mothers' beds in the paupers or poor clinics. So really tried to capture this in the book and illustrate these stark differences. Just going to go through a few more pictures of Jewish life in Russia. Jews were not Russians. Jews were only allowed to live in certain parts of the Pale of Settlement, even with that, within shtetls. But there's some great pictures in YIVO of Jewish life and Jewish youth life in particular. Here we have a picture of Riga, which is another scene for the book, where I talk about these spires that are like bejeweled fingers rising up from the city. And what a stark difference if you look at this really urban, clean setting, I think, even from this, which looks a little bit older, a little more like you're in the countryside. Now this picture is from the beginning of the Scouts movement that happened in Russia. And in Israel, it's now called the Tzofim, Hatzofim movement. And this, one of my characters, Yuri, talks about how he was a part of the Scouts. And this was really the first movement to prepare Jewish youth to go to Israel, to settle the land that would become Israel, and teaching Jews how to fight. And I love this maybe because my children were part of Tzofim when we lived in Israel, and to see that it is still carried on today, that this history is still moved forward, is pretty amazing. And let's see if I can find, I have this one excerpt where so Yuri is actually the character who's pushed into joining the Scouts. So it's not like the Boy Scouts, don't think of it that way, because it's the same word. The word is translated as Scouts, but it was really about fighting and rising up. And I made Yuri a member of Zhytomyr, this town where actually the Jews from the Scouts movement fought against the pogrom. And so I'm just going to read a quick paragraph of him describing how he was pulled into the movement. He was actually a reluctant participant. And he said, after I arrived at my aunt and uncle's house, years before the pogrom, they approached me. Fight with your brothers, they said, at school, at synagogue. Sorry, this is page 222 for anyone who has the hardback. They waited in front of the house, at the market, always pushing, pushing. I gave in. I took their oath. The other boys, they couldn't wait to fight, but I didn't want to be there. You were scared. I understand that. I wasn't scared in the way you think. I feared what would happen if I didn't join. You were there for the uprising? Mary asked. I wasn't there when it happened, but I could have been. In Zhytomyr, we expected a pogrom. After Kishinev, everyone understood it was only a matter of time. Some newspapers even predicted dates, Passover, Easter, or May Day. Anyway, I knew the pogrom was coming, and I didn't want to watch. So there we have the fact that they did try to predict and call out dates for when pogroms were coming. Jewish newspapers published those dates, those grim predictions often, and tried, the youth were pushing these movements to fight and also to get to Israel. And then we have a picture of Russian youth getting ready for Purim. These are all Yiddish names, I think. I don't speak Yiddish, but there are a couple of Yiddish words that I recognize on their crowns there, moon in particular in the front center. You see a Hebrew school class there. So very fun. But, if you have, this is your life, these are your children, they're sitting in Hebrew school, you have a family, you have a home. The question is, when do we know it's time to run? And I always come back to my great aunt saying, you need to be ready. But how? When will I know? And they say, you'll know. You'll just know. And that's never been a good answer to me, but that seems to be what I've heard across the board. So I was very lucky that this book launched while I was living in Israel, and I got to present to a number of Israeli audiences. And always, people would come up to me afterwards. It's happened here in America too, but these stories, I guess because they were the first ones that I heard, stuck to me the most. One person came up in the middle of a conversation, a talk like this, and they said, I'm here today and alive because my grandmother knew to play dead. Her village was obliterated in a pogrom. She hid in the rubble. And then another woman stood up and she said, my grandfather hid in a coffin. So you hear these hard stories of escaping from parts of Russia, whether it was Russia or Europe for the Holocaust or earlier from pogroms. You hear these horror stories. Another one, I'll never forget the face of the Swedish sailor who pulled me out of the boat. I knew finally I'd live, says this one man who started in Germany and how he made his way up to Sweden to safety. I was on the Kindertransport. Strangers took me on a train. They were good people. This was my neighbor's father, actually, who was on the Kindertransport. And what always struck me when people told me these stories was that I thought that, there would be a sadness to them, but there was a pride. But even more than that, much like my great aunts, there was this push for tomorrow will be better. We're here, we're having a better life. Even after I would hear these comments, they said to me, fine, my grandfather hid in a coffin, they took me on the Kindertransport, and now I'm here in Israel and we're talking about literature on a random Sunday night. We're just talking about a book, and what a gift. What a tomorrow. They say le dor vador, right, from generation to generation. And there's this push for when you want a better life, when it's time to run, it's because you have hope and a dream for a future that is going to be better. So I start the book, or I should say every section of the book, again, we're going back to marking time. And I explain the Jewish calendar, which of course is different from the calendar that we use here in America, different from the calendar that was used in Russia. They're all different calendars in the book because I'm really trying to stress that there are different ways to mark time. And one of the chapters, one of the sections starts in the month of Av, the Jewish month of Av. And I write that Av is a time for mourning. Life is a cycle, and no sorrow is all consuming. The beginning of the month is marked by sadness, and the end is said to be designated for finding one's bashert, or one's soulmate. The saddest days are followed by the happiest. And I love that thought because that's really what has inspired me and pushed me as I'm writing this book and talking to all these amazing audiences about when is it time to run and what are you willing to give up? What do you do for family, like brothers and sister Miri and Vanya, or if you bring in other love too, right? What are you doing? So I'm going to get, sort of wind down here is talking about Einstein. I like to remind everyone that we think of Einstein as a professor who was living comfortably in New Jersey, but this was really the back end of his life. And war, chance, kept him from ruining his career. What if his 1914 expedition took a different turn? You don't know if you remember, in the beginning I mentioned that his math was wrong in 1914. What if he had tried to publish it and he didn't actually have the best equations for relativity yet? Would we still think of him as the man in the back, that picture that I showed in the beginning, or would he be the man in the front that we know today? What if the Swedish sailor hadn't seen the man's boat, that survivor that I got to meet while I was living in Vanana? Or the woman's grandfather hadn't thought to hide in a coffin? There are all sorts of twists and turns in history, and some of the real ones are even more scary and crazy than the ones that we invent. So one of my characters in the very beginning of the book, she says, her name is Ethel, and at the beginning of the first part of this prologue, she writes, I write, Ethel reached for Einstein's photograph and plucked it off the wall. It was easier to do that than she'd imagined. An alarm blared. The curator and his assistants came running. History needs a narrator, Ethel said. Perhaps this museum chose the wrong one. And that's really what I want to ask is, who is the narrator of history? In this book, obviously, I'm saying, is Einstein the only one? Is this the right narrator? And I'm trying to ask, what if somebody else had done it? What if somebody had beaten Einstein? So the middle of the journey is what makes us human. We know where Einstein ended up. We know where he began, but we don't know much about the middle. And that's what interests me the most. When and why do we run? So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and open it to questions. See if anybody has anything they'd like to ask about or add, or any stories you'd like to share.
We have a number of questions that have already come in.
Fantastic.
Well, one's an interesting comment of kind of connections. We have Charlotte Swenberg, who wrote that Mr. Burns was my physics teacher in high school.
Oh, that's amazing. So was he as amazing as he seems on that video?
Right, an amazing thing, amazing connection. But we have a student in the history and political science departments, Harrison Kurdman, whose grandfather came out of Russia, and he writes as follows. What do you believe the most important research materials are for reconstructing Jewish life in the pre-Soviet period and also the Soviet period?
Well, so Soviet and pre-Soviet obviously are two distinct eras because the history was so different, but also the technology is so different. So actually my third book is about Soviet Jewry, and I can actually access primary sources of actual interviews that Jews have given who escaped Soviet Union or came after the Soviet Union fell, came to America or Israel, and I can actually see them and hear them firsthand. So it's very different kind of research to dig into that versus 1914, 1900 or earlier, because there a large portion of Russia was illiterate. So you have some surviving photographs like I showed you, but you don't have much that's actually written by very many sources and in comparison, right? Because not everybody could write their story down, and certainly not everyone you couldn't record it in any way. So I think that YIVO offers just a stunning collection of photographs, and piecing together photographs with historical records is very hard and fascinating. And you get to the question of the narrator. How are you going to put those pieces together? Which is very different from Soviet jury later on, where you can look at the pictures, you can look at the historical record, and then you can actually hear people giving their stories. So, for example, the Jewish Women's Archive is an organization here in Boston that I'm working with. They have huge numbers of interviews with, refuseniks, people who came over. And so it's been very different, primary sources versus, sort of these other well-groomed historical sources that come out of 1914 and earlier. But there are luckily all sorts of Jewish archives. Hadassah Brandeis Institute is another one that I'm involved with. I'm a research associate there, so that I can research for my third novel also their records of Jewish American women who were organizing to bring Soviet Jewry to America. So it's very different materials.
There's another very important question that many of us probably have asked ourselves multiple times. The question is asked by Jackie Hauser, who is a student in my religious studies course at the present time. And Jackie asked the following. I think this is really an interesting question. I just wanted to ask, what are the most important qualities that you've discovered of Russian Judaism that you will make sure to share with your family and future generations? I am a Russian Jew as well. And since there is so much history and tradition between the two, I've always been curious of another person's perspective, since I feel like I have missed out from my late grandparents too.
Yes, it's this crazy, sad phenomenon. In the Soviet Union, you were not allowed to be Jewish, right? And many people tried to assimilate. And in Russia, many people tried to assimilate and just push all of the religious, your religious knowledge to the side. So you have, many Soviet Jews coming to America who are Jewish because all their papers are stamped Jewish, but don't actually know anything about the religion. Similarly, there were a large number of Jews who came over, like my family, in the 1900s, early 1900s, and refused to bring religion with them because it had, made them such outcasts, and they didn't want to be observant in any way. So, what do you take to give to your family moving forward? I keep going back to this, what I really saw in Israel, L'Dor Vador, from generation to generation, this belief in a better tomorrow, and that there's hope. So you may have had a horrible experience, you lost your family or you left everything, but tomorrow will be better. And in particular, this man who was the father of my neighbor living in Israel, who was on the kinder transport. I mean, his story, right, is heartbreaking, and yet there he is smiling and laughing, and he's a doctor practicing in Ra'anana because he said, I made a better life. We found a better life, and that's what my family wanted, and that's why they sacrificed everything and put me on that train. And so I try to remember that. I don't know if that's going to be useful to you or comforting in any way, because there's tragedy underneath that, right? And you can learn and try to bring some of the traditions back, but underneath that, there's this push for a better life and optimism to keep moving forward. And for me, I hold on to that. I hold very, very tightly to my heart, to keep going. And it's funny because you meet all kinds of different Jews in Israel and America. Some will eat pork, some won't. Some light candles exactly on time, some don't like candles at all. So you're right, all these different traditions, but what is it that's underneath all of it? And I find that optimism. So there's my
Jackie responds, and I'll just read you her response.
Great.
Extremely comforting. Thank you. Now, I'm sure there are other people who have questions to ask about this very rich presentation on your novel, and really, I think it will provoke people to say, I'd love to read it, and I'll go out and buy it, or I read it much too quickly and I want to go back now and understand it even better. But I hope you won't mind me asking a question. And I want, you know, in the beginning of your presentation, I thought you presented in a very um, extraordinary way the difficulty of writing, your desire on the one hand, your passion for it, but the real task of what it means to write. And your description of the writing process, I thought was extraordinary in and of itself in your presentation. And then, what did you tell? Was it your great aunt who asked you about the passports and the emergency money? What did you tell her?
My great aunts, yeah. So my grandmother passed away when I was young and very, very young. So it was her two sisters. I mean, I knew where the passports and the emergency money was because it was my job. So she said, "Do you know where they are?" Yes, I
Uh,
do. And I make sure my kids also know. And
really?
it's, that's still there. Yeah, yeah.
And I thought the usage of Hannah Arendt and that quotation about 1914,
Mhm.
where this chain reaction begins, and Hannah Arendt, who says that we have not been able to stop it since
Mhm.
1914 and the beginning of the First World War. That's an extraordinarily interesting way to think about the century that we were born into, or many of us were born into, and lived our lives in, and to ask with Hannah Arendt whether that chain reaction is still going on, and we may be
Mhm.
living through another moment or nexus of the of that chain reaction that was begun
Mhm.
with the real dissolution of the old world
Mhm.
prior to 1914 and the birth pangs perhaps of a new world.
Mhm.
What do you
Yeah.
think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I love Hannah Arendt, and I actually did my senior thesis on her way back in the dark ages when I was an undergrad at Harvard. And I think that she's an extraordinary thinker. And in particular, I spent a lot of time thinking about her notions of the space in between. There's space in between words, space in between people that you can't capture, but also between times, and this notion of what is in between. And um, I think that as a philosopher, as a writer, you think a lot about that because people say words are heavy. There are lots of ways to describe that space in between, which can be emotion, which can be fear, but you can sort of talk around it, but it's there and you can't nail it exactly what it is. And I think that she gets to that in that quote and in a lot of her work as we move forward. 1914, World War I, World War II, right, and the development in particular of weapons and so chemical weapons, atomic weapons, weapons of mass destruction, moving today to weapons of technology. And there again, you have this in between, and people can get lost in modernity in between. And I think that it's easy to get lost in there. And I love to turn to Hannah Arendt to think more about it. So I encourage anybody who's interested in these things to read her work. Some of it is controversial on the banality of evil, but some of it is just gorgeous and really can make you think about things that you might not have thought about before.
um, I have another question from Jackie. Um, and I always like to give an opportunity for undergraduate students to create questions for speakers. So Jackie writes, I have another question if there's time. And yes, there is. Since both Russians and Jewish people have both been targeted, what commonalities between the two during the 1900s that you describe? There are do you think that are things that our generation should learn from to avoid a future potential persecution?
I mean, that's tough, right? Even the way that was worded, Russians and Jews, they're not the same. So there's not equality there. Jews were the underclass. We were not treated as Russians. We were not permitted in universities except on extreme quotas, right? 1 or 2 Jews a year were accepted. So, when you look at the mistreatment or the unfair treatment, you can look today. There are movements, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, same idea of sort of the underclass versus, a more, I don't want to call it a ruling class today, but the overclass, I guess. So there certainly are always those issues. There are lots of all kinds of psychological studies about what makes someone feel more powerful than another, blue eyes versus brown eyes, or prison guard, non-prison guard, right? I mean, there are all sorts of studies that have gone on, but anything that gives someone the feeling of power, unfortunately, can become a divide that can lead to these inequalities that can be terrifying. But if anybody has questions about the writing process too, especially undergraduates usually ask me about that, or finding agents or anything like that, you're welcome to ask those too. It doesn't have to be strictly academic, because I know that it is very hard to be out there trying to be a writer and trying to get published. So, or keep asking academic questions. Those are great too.
Well, maybe I have, no, here's another interesting question and comment. I enjoyed reading about what life was like there then, because my grandparents left Russia shortly before 2014. This is Skona again asking this question, our good friend. And the photos you showed today really added to that. But I just wanted to tell you that seeing the bent light did not prove Einstein's theory. It just gave supportive evidence. Such physics theories can't really be proven, only disproven. There might be another theory in the future that supplants it, just as Einstein's supplanted Newton's. My question is, what are you up to in writing the second and third novels? That's a great question, Skona.
Yes. Wait, there's so much in there. But yes, I love that point that it could be disproven, and right, that physical evidence was used to then check the math. Because just last week, or was it 2 weeks ago, the presence of phosphine on Venus was possibly detected because everything else was ruled out, which is amazing, but it could still be disproven. So I love that point, because that's how science works now and always. And so we should always be on the lookout for that. Einstein could be disproven at any time, and I think he would welcome it, right? To say that is the true pursuit of true science, is to keep pushing and pushing, because I don't think he believes that he would have believed that he had all the answers. He thinks somebody else is coming. So I like to tell kids in particular, remember, Einstein couldn't get a job. He was doing terribly, right? When he came up with this idea of relativity. Math wasn't even his strongest suit. It was the ideas, and he had helpers. He had friends help him with the math. So I love that you pointed that out. So the next 2 books, thank you for asking. I'll tell you about Atomic Anna, which is coming, as was noted, in February of 2022. And that is the story of 3 generations of Jewish women, again from Soviet Union to America. And they work together to build the time machine that stops Chernobyl and saves their family. So that is coming. And I am in the thick of editing right now, reminding me that even when you sell a book, it is not close to finished, not even close.
Okay. I think we're coming to the end of our time with you, Rachel. And on behalf of all of us who have just absolutely enjoyed the past hour and almost 15 minutes with you, and are so overjoyed that we could make this bridge to last year when our program had to be curtailed, as so many other programs did, and that you would be a pioneer for us in using Zoom to continue our 20 plus years of Jewish Studies Symposia at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Let me also tell you that we always want to take advantage of our local bookstore. As Maeve DuVoy said at the beginning of this, Chaucer's is one of those great, great bookstores that has been here in Santa Barbara for almost, I believe 50 years. And so it's a wonderful, wonderful place. So if you want to buy A Bend in the Stars, think about calling Chaucer's on the phone and having them put it away, and you can drive right up to Chaucer's and they'll bring it out, and you can take it home and enjoy this extraordinary science thriller that our guest this afternoon, Rachel Birnbaum, has written. And let me thank you again from all of us. We can't applaud, but we thank you very, very much, Rachel.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure. It's all my pleasure. Thank you. This has been amazing.
Thank you very much. And we'll see everyone else, I hope, in November for our second event that you'll be receiving a notification of the Zoom number for shortly. So goodbye and enjoy the rest of this wonderful Sunday. Rachel, we look forward to reading Atomic Anna.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.